The bride was sent to the wrong ranch, but the little girl who clung to her skirt whispered words that would change everything. Montana Territory, winter of 1869. The wind knifed across the open plains, carving through snowbanks and whipping the land into a white, furious blur. Out here, miles from the nearest town, the world looked untouched by time, silent, cold, and merciless. And standing at the edge of that frozen stillness was a woman. Lila Hartman tightened her wool shawl around her throat as she trudged through the deep drifts, her boots sinking with each step toward the shadow of a lonely ranch house. Her gloved hand trembled as she lifted it to knock, but before she touched the door, it cracked open with a groan. A tall man filled the frame, his eyes storm gray and unreadable, studied her with a suspicion sharp as the winter wind. Deep lines hardened his jaw. His coat fell open just enough for her to glimpse a revolver holstered at his hip and a gold wedding band still circling his finger. Lila steadied her voice. "My name is Lila Hartman. I was sent here by the Missouri Match Agency. I am to marry a Mr. Carter." The man blinked once, slowly. His jaw tightened. "My name is Rowan Calder," he said, "and I did not order a bride." The wind slammed against Lila's back. She held her ground. There must be some mistake. She insisted. "Now let us said this was Ironwood Ranch. This is Ironwood Ranch, isn't it?" "It is," Rowan said flatly. "But there's no Carter here. You're at the wrong place, Miss Hartman." He started to shut the door. Lila stepped forward quickly. "Please, there's a storm rolling in, and the last stagecoach already left. For Fort Willow, I have nowhere else to go tonight." Rowan hesitated just for heartbeats. Then he stepped aside. "You can come in, but only until morning." Relief nearly brought her to her knees. She stepped inside, letting warmth wrap around her like a memory. The interior was plain but sturdy as stone, fireplace crackling, rough-hewn furniture, walls that felt like they hadn't heard laughter in years. She set down her small travel trunk and glanced around her. Child's bonnet hung beside a man's rifle. A wooden toy horse lay abandoned beside the hearth, and on the mantel, a woman's portrait, half-dusted, long untouched. Rowan's gaze followed hers. His voice stiffened. "She passed 3 years ago. My wife, her name was Maren." Lila nodded, respectfully. "I didn't come here to replace anyone. I genuinely thought this was where I was meant to be. But I don't have anywhere else to go." Rowan didn't answer. He simply pointed down the hall. "You can sleep in the spare room. At first light, I'll take you back to Fort Willow." Lila wanted to argue, but exhaustion dragged at her bones. She turned toward the hallway, but a soft sound stopped her. Footsteps at a small figure emerged from the shadows of a side room. A girl, no more than 5, barefoot in a faded blue nightdress, long dark hair tangled around her face, eyes wide, hollow, as if she carried more ghosts than a child ever should. Rowan froze where he stood, his hand lifted, not toward his gun, but toward his heart as if steadying it. The girl walked straight to Lila, silent, calm, determined. Then her tiny hand reached out and grasped the hem of Lila's skirt. She pressed her cheek against the fabric, and in a voice Rowan had not heard in 3 years, she whispered, "God finally sent you to us." The room went still. Rowan's breath hitched. He stepped forward fast. "Sophie," he whispered, voice cracking. "Sweetheart." The little girl didn't look at him. She only clung tighter to Lila. Rowan knelt slowly, disbelief etched across his face. She hasn't spoken since Maren died," he murmured. "Not one word. Not until now." Lila knelt too, leveling her eyes with a child's. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm Lila." Sophie's lower lip trembled. "Are you going to leave too?" The heartbreak in her voice felt like a blade. Lila cupped the girl's cheek gently. "No," she whispered. "Not tonight." Rowan watched them, his posture rigid, his eyes torn between awe and fear. For the first time since she'd arrived, his voice softened. "Stay," he said quietly, "at least until the storm passes." Lila nodded, but deep down she sensed the truth. The storm wasn't outside. It was already here, already inside this house, inside this family. And she had just stepped into the heart of it. The storm didn't break the next morning. It pressed down harder, sealing the roads in silence and burying Ironwood Ranch beneath a thick white blanket. Days passed, each one colder and quieter than the last. Rowan didn't talk much, but on the morning after Lila arrived, he announced she could stay until the weather cleared. He didn't say it kindly, but he didn't say it cruelly either. Just factual. A man surviving by routine, not warmth. Lila accepted without protest. Where else could she go? The ranch felt frozen in time. On the mantel, Maren Calder's portrait surveyed the room with soft, distant eyes. A thin layer of dust coated the frame as though Rowan couldn't bring himself to touch it, nor bring himself to put it away. A piano sat in the corner of the parlor, its surface scratched and the keys yellow with age. Lila lifted the lid slightly, then let it fall again. A house like this had once known music, lullabies, laughter. It felt wrong to disturb its silence. Her guest room held its own ghosts. Inside the wardrobe hung a single dress, fine lace in faded blue. The sleeves had been carefully mended at some point. Lila didn't need to ask whose it had been. Perhaps Rowan meant to pack it away. Perhaps he couldn't. Rowan himself kept his distance. He spoke only when necessary. His words clipped, contained. And yet, he noticed things. Before she woke, he added extra logs to the fire. When wind rattled her window, he hammered in a new panel. After seeing her struggle with a cracked kettle handle, he fixed it by nightfall. He did these things without acknowledgement, as though caring for someone was easier when he pretended he wasn't doing it at all. Sophie, meanwhile, began to unfold slowly, delicately, like a wildflower testing the spring air. At first, she skittered at the edges of any room Lila stood in, always near, never speaking, always watching. She carried a small rag doll with one missing button eye, clutching it like a lifeline. She didn't speak again, not a single word, but her silence was different now. Not hopeful. One afternoon, as Lila sat by the window mending a glove, Sophie placed a folded piece of paper beside her and scampered away. Lila opened it. 3 figures. A tall man, a woman with bright yellow hair, and a small girl holding both her hands. Above them, in clumsy, crooked letters, Mamala. Lila pressed the drawing to her chest, her throat tight. She didn't know whether to cry or smile. The next morning, Sophie brought her biscuits, if one could call them biscuits. The kitchen smelled of smoke, and half the batch was blackened on the bottom. But Sophie wetted eyes wide with a fragile kind of pride. Lila smiled as if they were the finest pastries in the Montana Territory. Sophie smiled back, her first smile since Lila arrived. Later that week, while Rowan worked in the barn, Lila sat outside with Sophie in the pale winter sunlight. The girl climbed wordlessly into her lap, curling there as though she had always belonged. Lila read to her from an old Bible she found on the shelf, not for doctrine, but for comfort. Sophie touched the edge of her sleeve gently, eyes drifting shut. Through the window, Rowan watched, his face unreadable but quieter somehow, less clenched. Warmth began to gather in the rooms of Ironwood Ranch, a fragile warmth, but real. And yet under the softness lingered something unspoken, a shadow buried deep in the house's silence, in Sophie's wary gaze, in Rowan's haunted restraint, a family beginning to heal, but not yet whole. The letter. Rowan found the letter by accident. He had gone to the guest room searching for spare blankets. Lila had mentioned a draft sneaking under her door. Beneath her folded shawl, an envelope lay partially open. He shouldn't have touched it. But grief and isolation do strange things to a man. Curiosity slips in like a draft through a crack in the wall. He unfolded the letter. The handwriting was delicate, gentle, but the words cut deep. Her injuries have healed well, but the internal damage is lasting. Childbearing is unlikely, if not impossible. Rowan exhaled sharply, as if the air had been punched from his chest. He folded the letter with trembling fingers and slipped it back beneath the shawl, though he now felt like a trespasser in her most intimate sorrow. That night the fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. Snow battered the windows. Sophie slept upstairs. The world outside howled like a beast. Lila sat in an armchair, shawl wrapped round her shoulders, staring into the embers. Rowan stood near the window, arms crossed as though bracing himself for impact. "I found a letter today," he said. Lila froze. Her shoulders lifted slightly, then dropped. She didn't look at him. "I didn't mean to pry," he added softly. "It wasn't intentional." "I know," she whispered. "You read it." "I did." Silence settled between them, thick, uncertain, heavy as the snow on the roof. Finally Lila turned toward him. The calm on her face was delicate, but her eyes revealed everything: the shame, the hurt, the fear of being seen too clearly. "I was a volunteer nurse during the war," she began. "Not trained, just someone who was needed." Rowan pulled a chair closer, sitting opposite her, giving her space but not distance. "There was a boy," Lila continued, 8 years old, carried to US wrapped in a Union flag. His mother wouldn't let go. She kept insisting he was still alive. Lila's voice wavered. "His face still haunts me." She swallowed, then touched her side as if the wound still echoed there. Then came the explosion. "They said I was lucky to survive, but the shrapnel," her breath hitched. "Whatever future I might have had as a mother ended right there." Rowan didn't look at her with pity or sorrow, but something steadier, stronger. "You saved lives," he said, "and paid a price most men I know would break under." Lila blinked, stunned. "There are scars you can see," he continued softly, "and scars you can't, but you're still standing, stronger than most." She looked away, eyes shimmering. "I don't want your sympathy." "You don't have it," he replied. "Only my respect." Their eyes met. Something shifted, not romance. Not yet. But the distance between them finally cracked, just a little, letting warmth seep in. It began with a drawing. Lila found it tucked beneath Sophie's pillow while changing the bedsheets. The little girl had taken to drawing often now stick-figure families, awkward horses, suns with too many rays. Most were bright and hopeful, but this one was not. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. When Lila opened it, her breath stilled. A small woman stood at the side of the page, sketched in jerky, frantic lines. Beside her, a large shadowy figure, thick-armed, dragging the woman by the wrist. On the ground lay another figure still, unmoving, and above that fallen body, 3 crooked words. P.A. is sleep. The charcoal marks were darker than anything Sophie had drawn before. Hard. Panicked. Lila's stomach twisted. That evening, Rowan knelt by the back door, oiling its hinges. Lila approached quietly and waited until he finished. Then she held out the drawing. He took one glance and sat down heavily, as though the air had been sucked from the room. "She draws a lot," he said, his voice flat. "But not like this," Lila replied. Rowan nodded, slowly, painfully. There was a long silence, the kind that weighed on the heart. Finally, Lila spoke gently. "I've never asked, Rowan, what happened to Marin." Rowan didn't answer immediately. He set the drawing aside, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked on the floorboards as though the truth was buried there. "I was drunk," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but every word landed like a blow. "That night she disappeared. We argued God knows about what, something foolish, something small. She went upstairs with Sophie, and I stayed by the fire. I drank more." He exhaled. "When I woke the next morning," Lila leaned forward carefully, softly, urging him on. "What did you wake to, Rowan?" His eyes were hollow. "Blood," he whispered, "on my shirt, on the floor by the back door. Marin was gone. So was her coat. Sophie was crying upstairs. And I remembered nothing." Lila's breath caught. "The sheriff, my cousin, came, asked his questions. But there was no body, no note, no footprints left after the storm. They called it a disappearance." He rubbed his temples, both hands trembling slightly. "People in town whispered other things. That she'd run off. That I drove her away. That I—" his voice cracked. "That I killed her." Lila shook her head softly. "Do you believe you hurt her?" Rowan swallowed. "I don't know," he said. "And that's the worst of it. I've begged my mind to give me something, anything. A moment, a memory, a truth." He closed his eyes. "But there's nothing. Just a hangover. And the blood." Lila reached out, resting a hand gently on his arm. "Rowan, why didn't you tell me this sooner?" His gaze met hers vulnerably. "Would you have stayed?" he asked. She had no answer, because she didn't know. The widow in the woods later that week. Rowan rode into Fort Willow to collect supplies. The moment he left the property, Lila bundled herself in a thick cloak and ventured through the snow, toward a cabin tucked near the tree line. The townsfolk had mentioned the woman, Widow Caro Benton, half-blind but sharp as winter air, living alone on the outskirts like an old wolf, watching the world. Lila knocked the door open a crack, revealing a tall, frail woman wrapped in thick wool, a scar running down the side of her neck like a pale rope. She peered with one good eye. "You're Calder's guest," the widow said. "Not a question. I'm staying with him." "Yes," Lila answered carefully. "I have questions." "Ha!" The widow stepped aside. "Don't we all?" Inside, the cabin smelled of herbs and wood smoke. Lila explained. Everything: the drawings, the blood, Rowan's memory loss. Widow Benton listened without interruption, rocking slightly on her heels. When Lila finished, the widow spoke. "That night, I heard a scream." Lila's breath caught. "From Ironwood Ranch. Around midnight, but my husband was already buried by then, and I don't go looking into trouble when the dark's as thick as tar." The old woman shifted her shawl. "The next morning, I saw footprints in the snow leading away from Ironwood Ranch, down toward the ridge." "How many sets?" Lila asked quickly. "2, the widow said, "but only one came back." A chill ran through Lila's body. "You told the sheriff?" "I did." The widow's mouth twisted. "But the sheriff was Rowan's cousin, Beckett Calder. Didn't want a scandal. Told me to keep quiet, so I did." Lila's heart raced. The truth wasn't gone. It had simply been buried like everything, in this land under winter's weight. And Sophie, Lila asked, could she have seen something that night? Widow Benton's face softened with a kind of sad wisdom. "Children see more than they speak," she said quietly, "and some hurts steal their words clean out of them." Lila left the cabin, feeling the air colder than before, despite the sun's weak glow. Footprints, a scream, blood Rowan couldn't explain, and a little girl who remembered more than anyone, realized that the past wasn't dead. It had only been sleeping. A house begins to thaw despite the shadows lurking beneath the surface. Daily life at Ironwood Ranch grew gentler. Sophie laughed snouty, breathy laughs like someone relearning joy. Lila taught her how to thread a needle and pull it through cloth with patience, not force. Their first little project was a handkerchief. The stitches wobbled. The flower looked more like a lopsided star. But Sophie beamed as though she'd created a masterpiece. From the barn doorway, Rowan watched Tom's crossed, his face unreadable, but softer than before. Later that afternoon, he lifted Sophie onto the back of a chestnut mare. "This one's gentle," he told her. "Her name's Bramble." Lila stood at the fence, watching as Rowan guided the horse slowly around the yard. one hand steady on Sophie's back. Every time the girl passed, she waved. She trusts you, Lila said when they returned. Rowan helped the child down, brushing snow from her shoulders, I suppose, he murmured. She knows when someone's worth trusting. That night, as the blizzard roared outside, Lila stepped out to pull in a forgotten water bucket. The freezing air slapped her skin. She wore only a thin shawl. Before she could turn back, Rowan appeared behind her and draped his thick coat over her shoulders. You'll freeze out here, he murmured. Their faces were close to close. His breath curled warm against her cheek. Snow dusted his eyelashes. Lila looked up. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were wounded, human, open. You? She whispered. He nodded, lingering only a moment before opening the door for her inside. The fire glowed. Sophie slept curled in a rocking chair, her doll tucked under her chin. Rowan stood by the hearth, staring at the flames. My wife, he said quietly. Marin. I met her at a summer fair. Lila turned slowly. He rarely spoke her name. She loved the color blue, Rowan said. Wore it even in winter. She kept this place alive long before I knew how. Taught me how to cook, how to hold Sophie without panicking. He gave a small, trembling smile. I still wear this ring, we said, lifting his hand, because I'm afraid that if I take it off I'll forget the sound of her voice. Lila stepped closer. Slowly, gently, she placed her hand over his heart. Maybe, she whispered, she'd want you to remember more than just her voice. Maybe she'd want you to remember how to live. Rowan swallowed hard. Know how, he said. You do, she answered softly. You already are. His hand hovered near hers, not touching, but close. The storm outside raged on. Inside, something fragile, something long froze and began to thaw. The snow began to melt in slow, quiet inches. Days stretched a little longer. The world outside Ironwood Ranch was still white, still cold, but not as merciless as before. Inside the house, warmth threaded its way through the rooms, stitching in the parlor, Rowan's steady repairs. Sophie's soft laughter echoing from the hallway. But peace has a strange way of warning people before it breaks. One afternoon, Rowan headed toward the southern fence to tend the horses. Lila stood in the doorway, sunlight glinting off the snow like shards of glass. That's when she spotted a lone rider approaching the ranch. He rode slowly, posture slumped with the weight of exhaustion. His coat was dusty, his hat battered, boots dragging with each step he took toward the porch. Lila squinted, uneasy. Something about the man's presence tugged at a memory she didn't have, but Sophie did. Can I help you? Lila asked, stepping outside. The man removed his hat. His face was weathered by years, sharp jaw set like iron. His eyes cold and rusted scanned the homestead with unsettling familiarity. Name's Burke Maddox, he said. Worked this place years back. Heard Rowan Calder still living here. Lila's heart tightened. Before she could reply, Sophie appeared in the doorway beside her, small hand wrapped around the frame. The moment the little girl saw him, her whole body stiffened. Then she turned and bolted inside, disappearing down the hallway. Miss Sophie, Lila called, but the child was already gone. Burke Maddox raised an eyebrow. Got skittish. Did she? Lila swallowed. Rowan's out by the south fence. Burke nodded once, then headed that direction without another word. The moment he was out of sight, Lila sprinted inside. Sophie's terrace found Sophie curled tightly beneath the bed in the guest room, shaking so hard the floorboards vibrated. Sophie, sweetheart, look at me, Lila whispered. Kneeling, the little girl didn't speak. Instead, she grabbed a piece of charcoal from the sewing table and began drawing on the wooden floor with frantic strokes. Lila watched, her pulse pounding. A woman, a child, a man with a blade. Blood dot the same dark figure Sophie had drawn before. Figure from her nightmares. Oh God, Lila breathed. You remember him, don't you? Sophie's tiny hand trembled violently. Lila stood, heart racing, and rushed toward the fireplace. She reached for the rifle mounted above it, but before her fingers closed around the barrel, the front door slammed open. The monster returned. Burke Maddox stood there. He filled the doorway with eerie calm. You're quicker than most. Yep, said Dot. Sophie whimpered beneath the bed. Lila stepped back, pulse hammering. You killed Marin, she said. Didn't she? Burke smiled, a thin, chilling stretch of his mouth. She wasn't meant to be there. Neither was the kid. But Rohan, he was too deep in drink to notice anything. Lila's blood ran cold. You won't get away with this again. Burke stepped forward, pulling a knife from beneath his coat. Can't risk her token now, he murmured. Lila lunged for the rifle butt. Burke struck first. He slammed the weapon from her grasp, sending it skidding across the floor. She tried to run, but his hand clamped around her arm. A scream tore from her throat as he shoved her down, raising the knife. No, a blur of movement. Sophie, the child screamed in raw terror, throwing herself toward Lila. Lila twisted her body, shielding Sophie just as the knife came down. The blade sank deep. Lila collapsed. Breath knocked from her chest, blood blooming across her bodice like a violent flower. Lila. A voice roared from the doorway. Rowan's fury. Rowan. He stood framed in the doorway, rifle raised, face twisted with fury, more feral than the blizzard winds. The gunshot cracked through the house. Burke stumbled backward, clutching his side. Rowan sprinted forward, kicking the knife away, then dropped to his knees beside Lila. Blood pooled beneath her. "Stay with me," Rowan choked, voice hoarse. "Lila, stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered. Sophie crawled to her, sobbing uncontrollably, pressing her small hands against Lila's arm as though she could hold her to the world by sheer will alone. Then Sophie screamed a word Rowan hadn't heard in years, a word he thought might never return.
"Mama!"
Rowan froze. Sobs tore from the little girl, her entire body shaking as she clung to Lila's arm. Neighbors, alerted by the gunshot, began arriving at the porch. One of them, a former deputy, recognized Burke Maddox instantly. Within minutes, they restrained him and sent for the sheriff. Witnesses, Sophie's drawings, the scream Widow Benton heard years ago. Piece by piece, the truth unraveled. Marin hadn't left. She hadn't run away. She'd been murdered by Burke Maddox, and Rowan had never laid a hand on her. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the woman bleeding out in his arms, a battle for life. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare. Lila drifted in and out of consciousness, her breaths shallow, skin pale as winter light. Rowan stayed beside her. He didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't move unless it was to cool her forehead or hold her hand. He whispered her name like a prayer, begged her to fight, begged her not to leave once. As dawn broke, her eyes fluttered open. "You stayed," she breathed. "I never should have let you get hurt," he rasped. A faint smile tugged her lips. Worth it for her. Sophie crept into the room, carrying a damp cloth. She climbed onto the bed and placed it gently on Lila's forehead, mimicking Rowan's movements. Then she looked at Rowan with eyes far too old for her years. "She's my mama now," the girl whispered. Rowan sucked in a trembling breath. He pressed Lila's hand to his lips. "You saved us both," he whispered. But Lila was too weak to answer, and Rowan feared he had already lost her. Lila Hartman stood at the window long after the fire had died, watching delicate spirals of snow drift past the glass. Her ribs throbbed beneath her bandages, but the deeper ache, the one lodged inside her heart, hurt far worse. She could not stay. Not in this house where she had nearly died. Not with a man who deserved more than she could ever give. Not when she could never give. Rowan, what his first wife once had, the fear she had carried for years, the fear of being unwanted, of not being enough, rose to the surface. And so she wrote. That morning, with trembling hands, she sat at the kitchen table and drafted a letter. "Dear Rowan, you have given me a warmth I thought I'd never feel again. But I am not whole. I cannot bear children, and you deserve more than I can offer. You and Sophie need someone who can give you a true future, not a broken one. Please know that I love you both, but love is not always enough." She folded the letter carefully. She set it on the mantel beneath Rowan Calder's portrait. Then she turned to pack. Upstairs, Sophie stirred from a nap. The house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before heartbreak. She tiptoed down the stairs, doll tucked in her arms, and saw the letter on the mantel. Her name was there, written in the second paragraph. "I cannot be her mother." The words might as well have been a knife. Sophie didn't cry. Instead, she turned on small, shaking feet, climbed the stairs again, and pulled on her boots, her scarf, her coat. Then she slipped silently out the front door into the cold dark. By the time Lila noticed the door drifting open, the wind had begun to rise. Panic slammed into her chest. She tore through the house, calling Sophie's name. "Nothing, Rowan." Lila screamed, bursting outside. "She's gone." Rowan had just returned from the barn. He dropped the saddle he was carrying into the snow, eyes wide. "What do you mean gone?" "She saw the letter," Lila said, choking on guilt. "She's thinks I'm leaving because of her." Rowan swore under his breath and sprinted to the barn. Within moments he had saddled Bramble, the chestnut mare, and hauled Lila up behind him. The storm was building fast, too fast. Snow whipped across the landscape, blurring every track. The wind howled, carrying away the sound of their voices. "Sophie," Rowan shouted into the white void. "Sophie, answer me." But only silence answered. They searched the riverbed, the tree line, the open field. Their throats went raw, calling her name. Then, just as night began to fall, Lila spotted a flutter of blue near the pines. "There!" she cried. Rowan leapt from the horse before it had fully stopped, a child lost in the snow beneath a gnarled old pine tree. Sophie lay curled in the snow, her little arms wrapped around her doll, her cheeks pale, her lips trembling. Lila fell to her knees beside her. "Oh, sweetheart. Oh, God, what have you done?" she whispered, pulling the shivering child into her arms. Sophie's voice broke, the air like a fragile twig. "You don't want me anymore," she whimpered. Lila pressed her forehead to Sophie's, her tears falling hot. "No," she breathed. "I was never leaving you. I thought I was protecting you. But I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong." Rowan knelt beside them, wrapping his thick coat around both of them, his hand shaking as he pulled them close. "Don't you ever run from us again," he said. voice cracking with fear and love. "You're our little girl. Nothing changes that." Sophie's small arms reached up and locked around Lila's neck. "I want you to be my mama forever," she whispered. Lila sobbed into her hair. "Then I will be," she said. "If you'll have me, I will." Rowan's hand found Lila's beneath the coat. He squeezed it with a promise he hadn't spoken aloud yet, but one she already felt settling deep in her heart. In the snow-covered forest with a storm raging, and the past finally behind them, a broken family found itself becoming whole. A new dawned the next morning. The storm had passed. The world outside was blanketed in soft, untouched snow. The trees bowed gently under the weight, and the air felt clear like the land had exhaled. Inside the house, warmth returned with even greater tenderness. Sophie lay curled beneath a quilt beside Lila on the couch, her tiny fingers intertwined with Lila's as though she feared letting go would make everything disappear. Rowan stood near the window, arms folded, watching the horizon with a new kind of stillness, a quiet conviction settling into his features. After breakfast, he asked Lila and Sophie to join him on a walk. They bundled up, stepping into the crisp air together. The sun glimmered over the snow, turning the landscape gold. Rowan led them to the creek where the water ran beneath thin sheets of ice. He stopped. "I've been thinking," he said, clearing his throat, "about what makes a family." Lila froze, her heart already aching with emotion. Rowan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a simple ring worn smooth by years of love, loss, and memory. "I wore this too long," he murmured, lifting his left hand. With a steady breath, he slid off Moran's wedding band. "She's gone, and I loved her. But loving her doesn't mean I stopped living." His gaze softened as he looked at Lila. "Sophie needs a mother, and I need you." Tears blurred Lila's vision. "Family isn't about where we come from," Rowan said. "It's about where we choose to stay." Then he knelt in the snow. "I choose you, Lila Hartman. Will you marry me?" Sophie slipped her hand into Lila, eyes shining. Lila knelt too, pulling Sophie into her arms. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child. "I'm so sorry for ever making you think I didn't want you." "I knew you did," Sophie whispered. "I just got scared." Lila turned to Rowan, her hand still resting on Sophie's shoulder. "I thought I wasn't meant for a family. I thought I wasn't enough," she said softly. "But you stayed, and so will I." Tears gathered along her lashes. "Yes," she breathed. "I'll marry you." Rowan slipped the ring onto her finger. Moran's ring, now carrying a new promise, a new beginning, a new family, forged not by blood, but by choice. 1 week later, Fort Willow's small church opened its wooden doors to a rare kind of wedding. Quiet, intimate, whispered about across the territory. Word had spread quickly. Not gossip about scandal or tragedy, but something far rarer on the frontier, a family stitched back together by grace inside the church. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows, painting soft gold lines across the pews. The scent of pine sap and winter hung in the air. Neighbors filled the benches, their breath fogging in the cold, but their eyes warm with anticipation. At the front, Rowan Calder stood in his best shirt, hands clasped behind his back. His shoulders squared, but his jaw tightened with nerves he couldn't quite hide. Every few seconds he smoothed the front of his vest, something he never did. He wasn't just marrying a woman today, he was building a new life, a new family. The murmuring in the church quieted as the doors opened. Lila entered. She wore a simple dress borrowed from the town seamstress, grim-colored with soft lace sleeves that brushed her wrists. Her hair was pinned with tiny sprigs of lavender, nothing lavish, nothing grand. And yet Rowan had never seen anything more beautiful. But it wasn't Lila who stole the breath from every throat. It was Sophie. The little girl walked ahead of her, wearing a blue dress that swayed around her ankles. She scattered white petals from a small basket, each tossed careful and deliberate, like she believed every petal was a blessing falling from heaven. Her cheeks glowed pink with excitement. Her dark hair brushed smooth. The townsfolk were silent, watching her walk, a child who had once been a ghost in her own home, now blooming like spring. When Sophie reached the altar, she turned to look at Rowan with a smile so bright it nearly undid him. The preacher cleared his throat. "Who gives this bride to be married?" Sophie lifted her chin proudly. "I do." Laughter rippled across the room. Rowan's eyes softened with light. He thought he'd lost forever. Lila joined him at the altar, her hands trembling just slightly as Rowan took them in his own. The preacher spoke of love, not the kind found in fairy tales or ballads, but the kind forged in hardship, loss, and courage, the kind that grows roots in the most unlikely places out here, in the wilderness of the American frontier. When it came time for vows, Rowan's voice wavered. "I have known grief," he said quietly, "and I have known the weight of blaming myself for things I could not remember. I lived in silence, believing the world had taken everything from me." He looked at Lila, tears gathering. "But then you came. And you didn't just warm this house, you gave us breath again. You gave Sophie her voice, and you gave me mine." Lila's fingers tightened around his. "I don't come to you perfect," she whispered. "I come with scars. Scars of battles, of laws, of things I can't change. I once believed that those scars made me lesser. unworthy of a family. Her voice cracked. But who both of you made me realize that love isn't about being whole. It's about choosing each other, again and again, even when it's hard. Sophie tugged gently on Lila's dress, and Lila bent so the little girl could whisper something in her ear. Lila smiled through tears. She says she'll choose as you to... She softly translated to Rowan. The preacher nodded, voice warm. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Rowan cupped Lila's face in both hands, not rushed, not hesitant, but full of reverence, and he kissed her. Sophie squealed with delight, throwing her remaining petals into the air. The congregation laughed, cheering softly, offering nods and smiles full of blessing. For the first time in years, Rowan felt something he'd forgotten, the shape of peace, a new beginning after the ceremony. The townsfolk gathered outside the church, greeting the new family with embraces, warm wishes, and crockery filled with winter pies. Snow crunched on the boots as people lingered, talking in small clusters. Sophie clung to Rowan's hand with one and to Lila's with the other, forming a chain she refused to break. A few townspeople brought up Burke Maddox's arrest, shaking their heads at the darkness finally dragged into the light. Rowan answered their questions quietly, not with the weight of guilt anymore, but with something steadier closure. Lila held Sophie on her hip, watching Rowan speak with a group of ranchers. His voice was calm, his smile real, not forced, not mourning, healing. When Rowan finished, he crossed a snowy yard toward them. Without hesitation, he slipped an arm around Lila's waist and pressed a gentle kiss against Sophie's temple. "You two ready to go home?" he asked. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "Our home," she corrected. Lila's throat tightened. "Our home," two simple words that carried the weight of redemption. The first night back at Ironwood Ranch, firelight flickered across the walls. The house, once heavy with sorrow, glowed as though waking from a long sleep. Sophie drifted off early, curled between them on the bed, her tiny hand resting over Lila's heart. Rowan brushed a strand of hair from Lila's forehead. "You still in pain?" he murmured, glancing at her bandaged side. "A little," she admitted softly, "but less than before." He nodded, thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Lila," he whispered, "I know you think your scars make you less, but to me, they make you brave." She looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. "I never thought I'd have a family," she said. "Never thought I'd belong anywhere again." Rowan leaned close, pressing his forehead to hers. "You belong here," he breathed. "With us." Sophie stirred then, mumbling in her sleep and curling closer to Lila. The three of them lay together, wrapped in warmth, wrapped in something deeper than comfort, something earned, something fought for. A family not born, but chosen. A family finally whole. The days that followed settled into a quiet, comforting rhythm, the kind of peace none of them had known in years. Winter was still clinging to the land, but its bite felt softer, gentler. Lila rose early each morning to tend the fire, and Rowan would join her soon after to begin the endless work of ranch life. Sophie followed them both like a tiny shadow, clutching either Lila's hand or Rowan's sleeve, unwilling to let either drift too far. For the first time, Ironwood Ranch felt whole, for the frontier had a way of testing anything fragile, anything new. Trouble arrived, not with guns or storms, but with a visitor from Rowan's past. It happened on a quiet afternoon when Lila was helping Sophie stitch the hem of her little blue dress, sitting in the sunlit parlor. Sophie's stitches were uneven, but she beamed with pride every time she completed one. "You're learning so fast," Lila praised gently. Sophie smiled shyly. "Mama teaches me good." Lila froze for just a moment. The word still hit her like a blessing she wasn't sure she deserved. But she didn't correct Sophie, she simply kissed the top of her head. That's when the knock came. A hard Ojan rhythm that didn't belong to a neighbor or wandering ranch hand. Rowan emerged from the kitchen, brow furrowed. "Stay here," he murmured to Lila. He opened the door. A man stood on the porch, tall and stern, wearing a sheriff's star on his chest. Frost clung to his mustache. Sheriff Beckett Calderon's cousin. The very cousin who once ignored the truth about Marin's disappearance. Rowan stiffened. "Beckett, Rowan," the sheriff replied. His eyes flicked past Rowan to Lila and Sophie inside. "Mind if I come in?" Rowan's jaw tightened. "It depends," Beckett sighed, removing his hat and revealing hair streaked with gray. "I ain't here to fight," he said, "or to accuse. I'm here because of Maddox." Lila felt Sophie grip her skirt. Rowan stepped aside reluctantly, and the sheriff entered, eyes scanning the room with a heaviness that suggested he expected ghosts to be hiding in the corners. They sat at the table, Sophie clinging protectively to Lila's lap. Beckett spoke first. "We interrogated Burke Maddox again. He confessed everything. Your wife's murder, how he broke in, how he staged her disappearance." Rowan didn't flinch, but his hands curled slowly into fists on the table. "It took years," Beckett said, voice low. "And I'm sorry, cousin, I should have listened when the signs didn't add up." Rowan stared at him, the silence loud with years of blame and regret. "I failed you." the sheriff said, and I failed to. The weight of that truth hung in the air. Rowan finally spoke. I blamed myself for so long. I didn't know how not to. Beckett nodded solemnly. Well, the law's got him now. He'll swing for what he did. The words should have brought relief, but justice doesn't erase memory or guilt. Beckett cleared his throat. One more thing. I heard about the wedding. His gaze softened as he looked at Lila and Sophie. About new family. Sophie buried her face in Lila's shoulder. Beckett's voice softened. I'm glad you found your way again, Rowan. Truly. Rowan didn't smile, but his expression eased. Thank you, he said quietly. The sheriff stood, preparing to leave, but before he reached the door he paused and added, take care of them. His eyes flicked to Lila. They're your second chance. Don't waste it. Rowan nodded once. The sheriff left as abruptly as he had come, and the house fell into silence again. Sophie was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Is the bad man gone forever? Rowan knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. Yes, he said, and he'll never hurt you again. Sophie nodded slowly, trusting him completely. A family growing into itself. Spring crept in slowly, softening the edges of winter. Snow melted into trickling streams that fed the plains. Shoots of green began breaking through the soil. Ironwood Ranch transformed with the season. Lila woke before dawn, sometimes to the sound of Sophie giggling as she curled between her and Rowan, sometimes to the sound of Rowan pretending to snore loudly until Sophie pounced on him. Rowan taught Sophie to feed the chickens. Lila taught her to read simple words. Together they cleaned the barn, tended fences, and mended clothes piece by piece. New memories began layering over old wounds. One evening Rowan found Lila standing by the fence line watching the horizon, blush with sunset. He stepped up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. You're quiet today, he murmured. Lila smiled faintly. Just thinking about how much has changed. Good changes, Rowan asked, though his voice carried a hint of worry. She turned to face him. The best kind. He kissed her forehead softly. I never thought I'd have this again, he admitted. A home, a family, peace. You deserve it, she said gently, after everything you lived through. Rowan's eyes shone with something deeper than gratitude, love, steady and warm. And he asked, do you feel like you belong here? Lila looked toward the house, where Sophie's laughter echoed faintly. Her heart swelled. I've never belonged anywhere more, she whispered. Rowan pulled her close, holding her as the sky melted into shades of gold and rose. But not all wounds are healed that night. After supper, Lila stepped into the parlor to fetch Sophie's doll. On the table lay one of Sophie's new drawings, Rowan smiling, Lila holding Sophie's hand, bramble grazing in the background. But tucked in the corner of the page was something else, a small, shadowy shape drawn in charcoal. Not as dark as before, not as terrifying, but still there, a lingering ghost in Sophie's memory. Lila's chest ached. Healing came slow on the frontier, but it came. She kissed Sophie's forehead as she tucked her into bed. You're safe, she whispered. We're all safe now. As she blew out the lamp, Sophie murmured sleepily, because Mama and Papa keep me safe. Lila froze. Rowan did too, standing in the doorway. For the first time, Sophie hadn't called them separate names. For the first time she had called them a family. Rowan met Lila's eyes across the dim room. No words, just a shared breath. A quiet truth. They were becoming exactly what they were meant to be, together. Spring settled fully over Ironwood Ranch, dressing the land in green and gold. The river thawed. Wildflowers pushed through the earth in soft pinks and yellows. The long, brutal winter felt like a distant memory, one that belonged to another life entirely. Inside the house, laughter filled the rooms that had once echoed with silence. Sophie darted through the hallway clutching her doll, her footsteps light as feathers. Lila chased after her with mock indignation, and Rowan watched from the doorway with a soft, quiet pride that warmed him deeper than any fire ever had. Every so often, Rowan would catch Lila's gaze, and the smallest smile would pass between them, a smile that said, we made it. The world outside had finally calmed, but the frontier always held one last test. A letter from the past one afternoon, when the air smelled of sun-warmed earth. A messenger arrived from Fort Willow with a sealed envelope. Rowan broke the wax as Lila and Sophie stood beside him. The letter was from the judge overseeing Burke Maddox's case. He confessed more this time, Rowan murmured, reading aloud softly. He admitted he targeted our ranch because he believed Marion would be alone that night. He said he didn't expect Sophie to wait. Lila touched Rowan's arm gently. Rowan swallowed, jaw tightening. He said Sophie fought him harder when any full-grown man ever had. Sophie blinked up at her father, confused but unafraid. Rowan knelt beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her face. You saved yourself, sweetheart, he whispered. Even when you were little, you were brave. Sophie pressed her forehead against his. But I was scared, she whispered. Rowan smiled faintly. Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about fighting anyway. The judge's letter ended with the news that Burke Maddox's execution date was set. Justice finally. Rowan closed the letter, exhaling slowly like releasing years. Off breath he didn't know he'd been holding. It's over, Lila said softly. Rowan rested his head against hers. Now, it truly is. A new season of life has weeks passed. The ranch transformed into a place of routine and joy. Lila planted a small garden behind the house. Sophie helped her bury seeds in the soil, patting each one gently like tucking in a baby for the night. Rowan repaired the sow fence, rebuilt the chicken coop, and even carved a wooden bird for Sophie, something she carried everywhere afterward. Night, they all sat by the fire. Sophie curled in Lila's lap, Rowan's arm draped over Lila's shoulders, the house humming with life. Still, even in peace, there were moments when sorrow slipped in. Times when Rowan would glance toward the mantel where Moran's portrait once stood one evening. He found Lila dusting that very spot. Rowan, she whispered, I think it's time. He hesitated, grief flickering across his eyes. Time for what? Time to move her picture. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Lila rested her hand on his cheek. We're not replacing her and we're not erasing her, but we need space here too. You, me, Sophie, we need to build our own memories. Rowan nodded slowly. Together. They lifted Moran's portrait with reverence and placed it in a wooden chest Rowan had built years ago. Lila added sprigs of dried lavender, respect, not removal. When they closed the lid, Rowan exhaled shakily. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For understanding that love can remain, even as life moves on. Lila kissed his knuckles, and for letting me be part of that life. Sophie's first word of summer sunlight poured through Sophie's window as she sat at her small desk, drawing with charcoal and colored pencils. Her pictures had changed drastically. No more shadows in the corners, no more figures falling, no more dark scrolls of fear, instead a horse grazing in a meadow, a woman and a man holding hands. A little girl with a bright smile. In the newest drawing, Sophie had written 3 words in careful, clumsy letters. Our family forever. Lila's eyes filled with tears. Later that day, Rowan returned from the fields, exhausted and dusty. Sophie ran toward him, arms outstretched. Papa. Rowan laughed as he scooped her up. There's my girl. Then Sophie looked at Lila and said something she'd never said with such confidence. Mama. Look what I drew, Mama. Not whispered in fear, not spoken in desperation, but declared. Lila knelt, hugging her tightly. I love it, sweetheart. Rowan wrapped his arms around them both, pulling them close. There were no more ghosts in Sophie's eyes, only light. The peace they fought for that night. After Sophie fell asleep clutching her newest drawing, Rowan and Lila stepped out onto the porch. The moon hung low, silvering the fields. Crickets hummed in the tall grass. Rowan slid his hand into hers. You changed everything, he murmured. No, Lila replied. We changed everything. Together. He tilted her chin, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I never thought love could come twice in a lifetime. Lila rested her head against his chest. Love isn't counted, she whispered. It's chosen. He held her tighter as the night breeze swept across the plains. Inside the house, Sophie stirred softly, a small smile on her lips, even in sleep. A smile safe, a smile healed, a smile home. The final word. The camera would pan slowly across the Calder homestead, the porch glowing with lantern light, the field stretching into dusk, the small family framed inside the windows. Because in this Western love, the story, it wasn't the bullets, or the storms, or the ghosts that defined them. It was choice, it was grace, it was the courage to love again. Rowan found peace, Lila found belonging, and Sophie found her voice. A family not born of blood but chosen with courage, a family that survived the cold, a family made whole. And as the night closed in around Ironwood Ranch, a single whisper seemed to rise from the land itself. Love will always find its way home.